"We'll go early in the morning," suggested Tolu, "when most people are still asleep and others are busy with their tasks." Bayo nodded in agreement. "We'll be quick. If anything feels wrong, we'll leave immediately, no hanging around." With their plan set, the two felt both excited and nervous. They knew they were breaking the rules, but their curiosity was too strong to ignore. That night, they went to bed with their secret plan on their minds, wondering what mysteries the forbidden room might hold. The room, silent and untouched, seemed to be waiting for them. The next morning arrived quietly, with the sky still dim. Tolu and Bayo woke early, feeling a mix of excitement and fear. They crept out of bed, careful not to make any noise that might wake the other servants or guests. Moving softly through the quiet house, they made their way to the forbidden room. As they got closer, the air seemed cooler, and the hallway felt oddly long. The door stood before them, large, old, and imposing. When Tolu reached out, the handle felt cold against her hand. Bayo stood guard as Tolu took a deep breath and slowly turned the handle. The lock clicked open with surprising ease, as if the door had been waiting for this moment. With her heart pounding, Tolu nudged the door open with her foot and stepped inside. The instant she crossed the line, the light from the hallway vanished. Swallowed by a deep, impenetrable darkness, "I can't see anything," she called out, her voice trembling with fear. Outside the room, Bayo strained to hear Tolu's voice. As he listened closely, the sounds around him started to fade, like he was sinking underwater. Before long, there was nothing, no birds, no distant noises, and no sign of Tolu. Alarmed and desperate to help, he stepped into the room to find her. As he crossed the threshold, his sight remained, but an eerie silence engulfed him, taking away his ability to hear or speak. Inside, Bayo could see the room clearly, a simple space with only an old chest at its center. However, no sound reached him, not even his footsteps or Tolu's cries. Meanwhile, Tolu, trapped in complete darkness, could hear Bayo moving but couldn't see him. "Bayo, are you there? Can you see me?" she shouted, her voice echoing strangely in the endless blackness. Bayo, unable to hear her voice, tried to communicate by moving closer, his hands reaching out blindly. He could make out Tolu's faint outline as she reached for him, but when he tried to respond, his voice was completely silent. Frustrated and afraid, he finally found her arm and held on tightly. They stood together, one unable to hear, the other unable to see, both caught in the strange, overwhelming effects of the room. Panic began to rise as they realized they were trapped, isolated in two different worlds, unable to fully communicate or understand what was happening. Determined to escape, Bayo took Tolu's hand and began leading her back toward the door. He hoped stepping out of the room would end their nightmare. The moment they crossed the marked line back into the hallway, their bodies collapsed to the ground. Both Tolu and Bayo were lifeless, their skin pale and cold. The mansion's silence swallowed the tragedy, and no one knew what had happened. As dawn broke on the day of the long-awaited ceremony, the village buzzed with energy. People hurried about, preparing for the festivities, their voices mingling with the sounds of the early morning. Inside the grand house, Bolu was busy overseeing the final arrangements. At first, she didn't notice that Tolu and Bayo were missing. The two were always reliable, and their absence didn't immediately raise suspicion. But as the hours passed and they were nowhere to be found, Bolu began to worry. "We haven't seen them this morning," one of the servants informed her, his face tense. Bolu's chest tightened. It wasn't like them to disappear, especially on such an important day. "Search everywhere," Bolu instructed, her voice trembling slightly. "The gardens, the storerooms, every corner of the mansion. Find them." The servants quickly scattered, calling out the two names as they searched. "Tolu, where are you? Bayo, where are you too?" Their voices echoed through the halls and across the grounds, but no response came. Tolu and Bayo were not in the kitchen, the garden, or along the familiar path to the mansion. The more places they searched, the stronger Bolu's unease grew. As midday approached, the cheerful anticipation of the ceremony gave way to anxiety in the household. Bolu stood by a window, her mind racing. She tried to recall the last time she had seen the two servants, but nothing seemed out of place then. They wouldn't just leave, she muttered to herself, gripping the windowsill. By the time the first guests began arriving, the house was in quiet chaos. Bolu instructed the servants to keep Tolu and Bayo's disappearance a secret. "Don't mention this to anyone," she said firmly, her tone brooking no argument. "Not their parents, not the chiefs, not the elders, no one." As day turned to evening with still no sign of Tolu and Bayo, Bolu's worry turned into a deep, chilling fear. She stared toward the hallway leading to the forbidden room, the one no one was allowed to enter. A thought crept into her mind, unshakable despite her efforts to dismiss it. "They would have told me if they were going somewhere," she whispered to herself, her eyes lingering on the shadowed door at the end of the hall. The search continued late into the night, with lanterns casting flickering light as servants searched the house and around the area. But Tolu and Bayo remained missing, and the house felt heavier with each passing hour. Bolu, standing by her window, watched the search parties with growing dread. Her home, once vibrant and full of life, now felt suffocating, as though it was hiding something terrible. Days passed, and the unease in the house grew unbearable. The servants moved quietly, their faces etched with fear and exhaustion. Bolu barely ate or slept, consumed by guilt and dread. Then, a foul smell began to creep through the house. At first, Bolu thought it might be something spoiled in the kitchen, but the stench grew stronger, more overwhelming. It was the unmistakable scent of decay, and it filled every corner of the house. The servants whispered anxiously, covering their noses as they worked. "What could it be?" one murmured, glancing nervously at the forbidden room. By the third day, the smell was unbearable. Bolu wandered the halls, pale and restless, the odor seeming to mock her growing fear. That night, lying awake in her bed, she couldn't escape the thought that the source of the smell lay behind the forbidden door. Early the next morning, Bolu summoned her most trusted servant. "We can't ignore this any longer," she said, her voice shaking. "We need to find out what's causing it." The group of servants and elders moved cautiously through the house, their faces lined with worry as they whispered among themselves. The foul smell lingered heavily in the air, growing stronger as they approached the end of the hallway. One of the elders stopped abruptly, sniffing the air. "It's coming from that direction," he said, pointing toward the door at the far end of the hall. Bolu, trailing behind, felt a lump form in her throat. She knew which door they were heading toward, the forbidden room. Another elder turned to her. "Bolu, what is in this room? Why is it locked?" Bolu hesitated, her heart pounding. It was always locked," she said quietly. "My parents told me it was a special room, and I was never allowed inside. I don't even have the key." The servants exchanged uneasy glances, and one of them said nervously, "But the smell. It's coming from there. We can all feel it." An elder stepped forward, his voice firm. "If the key is missing, we have no choice. That door must be opened. This smell, it's unnatural." Bolu looked at them, her eyes wide with fear. "But your parents are no longer here," the elder interrupted gently but firmly. "We need to know what's inside. For the safety of everyone in this house, the door must be broken." The group stood in tense silence for a moment, the weight of the decision pressing down on them. Finally, one of the stronger servants stepped forward, wielding a heavy tool. "Stand back," he said, his voice trembling. Bolu stepped aside, clutching her hands to her chest as the servant raised the tool. With a loud crash, the door gave way, swinging open to reveal the dark and chilling secrets inside. Inside, the truth was revealed. Tolu and Bayo lay on the cold floor, their lifeless bodies pale but peaceful. A gasp rippled through the group, followed by silence. Bolu stared at the sight, her hands trembling. Tears streamed down her face as the reality set in. The two, loyal and beloved, servants had paid the price for a secret she hadn't understood. The elders exchanged solemn glances. One spoke softly, "This house holds a darkness, Bolu. One that must be confronted." Bolu, overwhelmed by grief and guilt, could only nod. Tolu and Bayo's tragic fate was not just a loss, it was a warning. And the weight of her family's hidden past now rested fully on her shoulders. The news of Tolu and Bayo's deaths had spread quickly, and the once quiet whispers of grief had turned into sharp accusations. A crowd had gathered in the square, their voices growing louder with each passing moment. How could something so terrible happen under her roof? One man shouted, his voice cutting through the crowd like a blade. Convened to address the situation. The head elder stood before the crowd, his expression grave. Bolu, you are accused of harboring darkness within your mansion, a darkness that has taken the lives of Tolu and Bayo. What do you say in your defense? Bolu, trembling under the weight of the accusations, raised her hands in a plea for understanding. I knew nothing of the evil in that room, she cried. I obeyed my parents' wishes to keep it locked, believing it was for the good of the family. I would never harm Tolu and Bayo. They were like family to me. But the crowd, consumed by fear and grief, would not listen. Liar. Someone shouted. Her family has always been strange. This was bound to happen. The elders exchanged troubled glances. They did not fully believe the accusations against Bolu, but the village's collective fury left them little choice. The head elder sighed deeply before speaking. For the safety of the village, we must act decisively. Bolu, your presence has brought darkness upon us, and we cannot allow it to continue. As dusk fell, the village gathered at the outskirts of the settlement. Bolu stood bound to a wooden post, tears streaming down her face. She searched the crowd for a friendly face, for anyone who might defend her, but found only cold, fearful stares. The elders lit the pile of wood at her feet, the flames catching quickly and climbing toward her. Bolu's cries of protest turned into a piercing wail of anger and despair. As the fire consumed her, she summoned her final strength to curse the people who had turned against her. I curse this village, she screamed, her voice cutting through the crackling flames. May you all face the pain of false accusations. May you know what it is to be betrayed by those you trust. Her words echoed into the night, sending shivers down the spines of those who had condemned her. The fire roared, and Bolu's voice faded, leaving the village cloaked in an eerie silence. The following morning, a sense of unease lingered over the village. Though Bolu's death was supposed to bring peace, the air felt heavier, and the sky darker. Strange things began to happen. Livestock wandered off and disappeared. Crops withered overnight. Quarrels broke out among neighbors who had been friends for years. The village, once a close-knit community, became rife with distrust. One day, a child ran into the square, screaming about a shadow that had spoken to her in Bolu Mom's voice. She said the curse is real. She's still here. The child cried, her wide eyes filled with terror. The elders gathered to discuss the growing unrest, but they too were not spared. Each night, they were haunted by dreams of Bolu, her face twisted in rage, her voice a chilling whisper, "You will know my pain." Realizing that their actions had unleashed a curse, the elders called for a cleansing ritual. They sought the help of an elderly priestess, who lived on the outskirts of the village. The priestess arrived, her presence commanding, and surveyed the village with knowing eyes. The spirit of Bolu lingers because justice was denied, the priestess said. Her anger feeds on your guilt, and it will not rest until the truth is uncovered. The villagers, desperate to end their suffering, agreed to the ritual. Over 3 days, they offered sacrifices and prayers, begging Bolu's spirit for forgiveness. On the final night, as the priestess completed her chants, a strong wind swept through the village, extinguishing every flame and leaving them in total darkness. In that silence, Bolu's voice rang out one last time. You chose to punish me without seeking the truth. May this serve as a lesson. Harm none without cause, for the darkness you fear often lies within yourselves. With that, the oppressive weight lifted, and the village returned to a fragile peace. Yet, the memory of Bolu and the events that led to her tragic end remained etched in their hearts. The forbidden room was sealed forever, and the villagers lived with the understanding that fear and ignorance were their true enemies. The once bustling village now moved with caution, each step a reminder of the past. Bolu's name became a quiet warning, whispering to children who strayed too far from home, beware the wrath of the wronged. Yet, even now, no one truly knows what was in that secret room or the dark forces that claimed their lives, leaving the mystery and its consequences to haunt the village. The moral of the story is that when your mind is unsettled by doubts or questions, it is better to seek the truth than to blindly follow what you've been told. Ignorance and fear can lead to tragedy, but understanding and courage to uncover the truth can prevent harm and foster wisdom. If Bolu had sought to uncover the secrets of the forbidden room, she might have prevented the terrible fate that befell Tolu and Bayo.